Professor of philosophy at King's College London, and has an interest in maths.
Well, actually, it's a great honour to be asked to introduce your book, which is a rich and very interesting exploration of quite a complex subject matter. So I thought I'd just say some very, very brief words about how I see Anthony's book within contemporary moral theory and some of the questions it raises. And fairly obviously, sexuality is a deeply central feature of human life at a number of levels. It's a central feature of our biology. It involves sexual relations and the related phenomenon of sexual attraction, procreation, and the obviously very familiar gender distinction between men and women. And then it has a distinctive psychology which runs into this biological reality, involving central motivations of desire, sexual desire, and sexual love, which also occur in forms of apparently similar forms of desire and love outside sexual contexts and wider areas of our psychological life. And then, because of course, human beings are social and political animals, the phenomenon of sexuality is recognised at the social and political level in institutions such as the family and marriage, which are in turn historically given political recognition and then regulated by the state. And central to this whole phenomenon historically has been, of course, the phenomenon of procreation. As untraditional a moralist as Bertrand Russell famously observed, that if it had not been for the connection between sexual relations, gender and procreation, it's very hard to think of the state, why the state should have taken so historically strong an interest in marriage as it has done in centuries. Moral reflection in the European past has tended to share this interest in the connection between sexuality and its procreative function, in particular, its procreative effect, and the institutions that seem very much bound up with this, marriage and the family. But today, of course, we're facing a number of radical transformations. The first is a radical technical, medical transformation in which we see procreation or reproduction increasingly being detached from what would have been historically conceived of as natural sexual relations between men and women. And at the same time, we see quite complex, rapidly developing transformations in cultural and social, and increasingly now in political understandings of institutions like marriage and the family, transformations that are tending, like the technical transformations, to detach understandings of marriage and the family from procreation. So there we see developments. How is this panning out in contemporary philosophy? Well, I think it's probably fair to say that most moral philosophers, and I'm one professionally, do not write a great deal in any very great depth about the morality of sexual relations. And there's one very clear reason for this, which Anthony addresses centrally in his book, which is that most philosophers don't tend to think there's a distinctive subject matter, which is the morality of sexual relations. There's just morality, which is usually addressed or developed theoretically by using very general models, your Kantian model or your contractarian model or your consequentialist model. And it's generally thought that these should be fairly easy to apply to human sexual relations and capacities and to associated social structures in a fairly mechanical way as you crank out the general theory. There really isn't anything special to say about sexual, except it's a feature of human life like any other, to which your consequentialist or Kantian or whatever else it is model might plausibly apply. And in that context, it's generally assumed that such an application of a general model will probably vindicate current transformations at a general level, though the recognition of this is often rather broad and philosophers will often pass by and talk about some theoretically rewarding by their lights into the subject. And there the subject is very often left. Of course, central to this approach is the idea that there's nothing distinctive about the sexual side of human existence, either at the biological or the psychological or the social political, that would merit special attention by the moral theorist, that would lead them not to just apply mechanically a general model, but to look at the area in its own terms as possibly involving very distinctive values and phenomena. And a central question in Anthony's book is an inquiry by him as to whether there is something ethically special about the sexual. And he starts off by looking at one particular form of sexual wrong, which seems very distinctive, and it's the phenomenon of rape. And the interesting feature of rape is that it doesn't seem like any other just another kind of violent assault, only possibly just worse. It seems as though it might be different in kind and involve causing us a very special kind of moral disturbance and lead people to respond and react to it in very distinctive ways. For example, you might use other forms of violent assault as forms of punishment in some more sort of, shall we say, disciplined societies. But the use of rape as a form of punishment is perhaps rather less normal. Why would that be? There are lots of other, I think, interesting features that are distinctive of the sexual. One thing that occurs to me is that it's very interesting how virtually all states or political organisations tend to get very intolerant of widespread social dissension about the nature of marriage as that institution that somehow gives political recognition to human sexual relations. And that seems to be just as true of a modern liberal state as it was of more traditional states. It's just the consensus that's enforced, being quite carefully enforced, has changed radically in certain ways. But there's just as little toleration of public dissension about the now politically favoured forms of marriage that modern state, liberal state currently favours, as there used to be in the past for rather different models. Why would that be? There's nothing ethically distinctive about the sexual. Okay. If we're going to give a philosophical account of the sexual, we're going to have to say something in more detail about these various levels that it involves. The biological, the psychological, and the social political. And any philosophical approach, I think, to sexuality is going to say whether it's going to prioritise one of these areas over the others, or deal with all three of them at once, or what. And you might start with the biological and look at, tell some story about biological function that makes a lot of sense, or tries to make a lot of sense at a fairly biological end, and then try and pick up the thread by moving on to the psychological, then end up with an account of the social or political as a product of all this, but in a derivative way. Or you could go the other way around, as social theorists might want to do, or you could be more even-handed. I think it's probably true to say that Anthony's approach is interestingly complex. You will find in this book an account of the biological, and of the psychological, and of the social political, which I don't think prioritises one greatly over the rest, but sees the social and political recognition of human sexuality as importantly tied to the biological in particular, because he sees this social recognition as importantly natural. And so he's taking a line on the morality of sexuality that will be radically distinct from someone like David Hume. There's a famous distinction in ethical theory between the bits of morality that come with human nature, that precede contingent forms of human social interaction. The other bits of morality that are somehow genuinely moral, they exist, but they're in some way creations of human social interaction. Like, for example, in some views of what Hume called the artificial, this is what's created by human social interactions, the morality of property rights. Or the obligation to obey the state. before certain forms of human social interaction occurred, there wasn't such a thing as the morality of property or the morality of the obligation to obey the state, because these institutions didn't take place. And Hume famously says that chastity is another artificial virtue, by which he thinks the morality of the family and marriage and any form of social recognition of human sexual relations is entirely convention dependent. And it's the creation of human social interactions, and it's not natural at all. And Anthony is mounting a long argument in his book to say that actually it's natural. And he's contributing to what is a very, very deep problem in philosophy, where to draw the boundaries in morality between the natural and the artificial. He's also making a very, very important, I think, contribution to something of a debate within particularly Catholic natural law theory, which is the debate about something called the new natural law theory, which was developed in the 1970s, particularly by people like John Finnis, which was an attempt to do natural law theory, or to do morality as a sort of kind of law that comes with human nature, in a way that endorses a lot of traditional Catholic moral positions, but which resists deriving the content of the moral law or morality in any very straightforward fashion from an account of what human beings are actually like. It respects a sort of value, merely factual distinction that's fairly traditional within the analytic tradition, or seeks to respect it. And it also, interestingly, tries to give an account of the morality of sexual relations, which importantly detaches the morality of the actions they involve from their character as sexual acts. So we've got a very complex and interesting kind of Catholic moral theory that has a lot in common with certain features of moral theory in general, in the way that it tries to use general models that are detached from the particularities of certain forms of human life, like sexual relations. And Anthony, I think rightly, raises some very severe problems for this approach to the morality of sexual theory, as for any kind of theory that tries to incorporate the human sexual life within a general model. And there I will leave the matters and recommend you to read the book.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gosh, is that what I did? Tom was one of those lecturers, I remember, always like this, where students would often ask a somewhat incoherent question. And he'd listen very intently and somehow manage to extract a quite brilliant question from the student and then say, is that what you meant? And, oh yes! I was going to use a podium, but I think I'm more comfortable here if that's okay. First of all, just thank you very much indeed to everybody for coming. It's really very, very nice and touching. Some people I've known since my childhood, my mother, of course. I actually came into being... I came into being in the 70s, which was the source of this decade of rather bad ideas, actually one of which Tom was just alluded to. But she has, along with my aunt, who's also here, Joe, put up with me longer than pretty much anybody else. And also a number of very old friends over here. I can't name everybody, but you know who you are. I was going to say there are three people, apart from Tom, who've read the book. I was going to say, I'm expecting about 5. Yes. And I was going to say that it can't be that bad because they've come, but 2 of them haven't. So one has come through. I'm very, very grateful to. He also made very, very kind comments. I'd also like to thank my former supervisor, Jeff Hunt, he's not here, and the people from St Mary's, Anthony Towie, I think he's had to go. Well, a very great thank to all my colleagues from SPUC who've been very supportive indeed, they've put up with me throughout the years, especially John Smeaton, who showed great faith in me at a particular time, and really this book wouldn't exist without his support people who work with him. Well, that's enough about sort of gratitude and friendship. I'm actually here to talk about sex, which is possibly a somewhat different subject, albeit ethical sex. Well, actually, Tom has said a lot about the philosophical content of the book. He's put it far better than I could. So I'll go light on that. This is a slightly uneasy attempt to say a few sort of brief words and then try and explain some things, and then you wonder, is it going to turn into a talk, and is that what I want in a Q&A and things like that. So I just want to say basically some just general thoughts and give you something of an atmosphere. I mean, this is not going to be a sermon against enjoyment or something like that. I'd be up there if it was. Although I don't really favour people enjoying themselves, so I hope you haven't been indulging too much. Well, St. Alphonsus Liguori, in approaching this subject in volume 1 of his Theologia Moralis, writes, "We are now reluctantly approaching that essential part of our topic, whose very mention corrupts men's minds." It's a rather extraordinary thing to say. And if you look at some of the old moral theology manuals, I remember having to plough through these. They're very sort of starchy books, often intended for seminarians, confessors. And I used to have to get to this bit to look up something, and they'd suddenly move from English to Latin. So unless you were very good at Latin, you couldn't understand these strange terms, plexus reservatus or something. And you had to get into these very dodgy areas. But evidently the assumption was that people who had good Latin were less corruptible than the immortals. But I thought it's appropriate to begin when doing this. I think a failing of philosophers, certainly some of the ones that I came across, was that they not only didn't really treat sex seriously, philosophically, but also that they didn't really refer to all the sources we have around us that talk about sex. That is, thinkers, playwrights, poets, all these people who've thought very long and hard about the subject, and arguably more profitably than many people in the analytic tradition, or at least many of them. So I begin the book with a number of quotations from different thinkers. And I'm just going to read some out now, just to give you an idea of how different people have treated this topic. So first of all, we have this. In virtue of its profound centrality and intimacy, as also of its mystery, sex is capable of a particular relationship with love, the most spiritual and deepest of all experiences. And that's Dietrich von Hildebrand, 20th century philosopher. Can everybody hear, by the way?
Yes.
The second, the degree and kind of a man's sexuality reaches up into the topmost summit of his spirit. And that's Friedrich Nietzsche. The third, set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm. For love is strong as death, passion fierce as the grave. Fourth is rather longer and will be familiar to some of you. The expensive spirit in a waste of shame is lust in action, and till action lust is perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame, savage, extreme, rude, cruel, not to trust, enjoyed no sooner, but despised straight, past reason hunter, and no sooner had past reason hated as a swallowed bait, on purpose laid to make the taker mad, mad in pursuit, and in possession so, had, having, and in quest to have extreme, a bliss in proof, and proved a very woe. Before a joy proposed, behind a dream. All this the world well knows, yet none knows well, to shun the heaven that leads men to this hell. And finally, a contemporary thinker. Enjoy your own sex life, so long as it damages nobody else, and leave others to enjoy theirs in private, whatever their inclinations, which are none of your business. Now, the previous one was William Shakespeare, the final one was Richard Dawkins, the best-selling God Delusion. So, I won't comment on that for a second. If, like me, you find that that last quotation is somewhat lacking in insight or seriousness, or seems to be a rather facile treatment of this area of life, then I think that there will be some parts of the book that will be of interest. I can't promise that lots of other parts of it will be, but because I do think that that is a really rather facile, clumsy thing to say. It contrasts, I think, with the other quotations, which are quotations by people of a very different kind. You know, Nietzsche and the Song of Songs and Shakespeare. These are very people with very different worldviews. But the problem with the Dawkins quote, I don't mean to pick on Dawkins. I mean, I think that's a cheap and easy thing to do, which is no reason against it. But this is a very commonly held view. It's not particular to atheism. It's not particular to his particular brand of Darwinism or something like that. It's a very commonly held view about morality as it applies, and as Tom sort of laid out here. It's also a view. We have a couple of philosophers here. I think I'm right in thinking that Peter Singer's practical ethics is still held on first-year undergraduate reading lists generally. Maybe on the date. So Peter Singer, who is dealing with ethics generally, moral philosophy, what it is to do good, to do right, is famously a utilitarian. So he has a particular view of the world. That we judge things by the consequences, as Tom suggested. He has in the opening of his book, Practical Ethics, the following statement, where he does mention the subject of sex, very briefly. He's famous in many ways for his interventions on the subjects of abortion, on animal rights, these kinds of things. Or something like that. It's a very commonly held view about morality as it applies, and as Tom has sort of laid out here. It's also a view, we have a couple of philosophers here. I think I'm right in thinking that Peter Singer's practical ethics is still held on first-year undergraduate reading lists generally. Is that maybe on the date? So Peter Singer, who is dealing with ethics generally, moral philosophy, what it is to do good, to do right, is famously a utilitarian. So he has a particular view of the world, that we judge things by the consequences, as Tom suggested. He has in the opening of his book, Practical Ethics, the following statement, where he does mention the subject of sex, very briefly. He's famous in many ways for his interventions on the subjects of abortion, on animal rights, these kinds of things. But he does mention sex right at the opening of his book, and he has this to say, which I think links him somewhat with the Dawkins approach. Find it. And I think all the more serious because he is being held up as a moral philosopher. This is what he does. He says, sex raises no unique moral issues at all. Decisions about sex may involve considerations of honesty, concern for others, prudence, and so on. But there is nothing special about sex in this respect, for the same could be said of decisions about driving a car. Now, I'm constantly reminded that I never actually got my driving license, so maybe I'm missing something. But I reckon there is more of a difference than that. And I think I begin the book by trying to enlighten this, that when people discuss sex, it can very quickly end up as saying, well, so long as people are consenting, that's all there is to it. Okay. I'm not saying this is a particularly immoral view or something like that. I'm just saying it's a way of avoiding thinking about sexual morality. So the first thing I say at the book after all these quotes is simply this question. Ought sexual activities, desires, pleasures, to be assessed only according to general moral principles which apply to other areas of our lives. As Singer says, various prudential judgments, which side of the road should I drive on? So that's driving. For example, is consent enough to justify our sexual choices? And if so, does that make sexual ethics different from other areas of ethics? Or alternatively, does it make it the same as other areas, if we are inclined to think of the rest of ethics is as thin as that? Now, I personally think there's a bit of a problem when people think in very contractual terms about ethics generally. Because again, I think that when people talk a lot about contracts, well, two rational individuals agreed this, so that's it. I think that's not really thinking about what's good and true, what it is to be a human being, what it is to flourish as a human being. I think those are the really interesting questions. And I think this mentality, and it seems particularly troubling to me when it comes to sex, partly because, and this is a phenomenological question, but partly our experiences. When Shakespeare describes what he describes, I think that has resonance. Partly because these experiences do seem very distinctive, especially. So it seems particularly troubling to me when people talk in terms of contract and things. And as I said at the beginning, Tom points out, things like rape are interesting in this way. It's a horrible subject, to talk about. That should tell us something already. It's interesting that actually, in a culture which maybe has quite a different view of sex than it did not so long ago, rape still has this huge charge with it. Rape seems to be specially wrong in some very important ways. And in fact, I'm sad to say actually, things like torture, I think under certain political influences are now, certain kinds of torture are kind of seen as acceptable. So you can have popular shows where the hero tortures people, and he's still a hero. I'm thinking of 24, if any of you watched that American show. But you still don't get shows where someone can rape someone and they're still okay. They're doing it for the government or whatever. So it does seem as though there's a different, and also when people talk about a ticking time bomb, they say, well, can you torture someone to prevent the atrocity? Okay, ticking time bomb. Again, I've yet to hear someone, and I hope tonight's not an exception, to say, oh, well, in that situation, if it would save 1,000 lives, you could rape someone. But again, that's a rather strange, if you don't view sex as in some way distinctive and special, that's a rather strange thing. Why should one kind of violent action against someone be so distinctive as compared to another? Another area where we see some problems is things like surrogacy contracts. So we get these contracts where a surrogate is to bear the child of somebody else, and people often will think there are serious ethical problems about it. Certain philosophers committed to certain ways of viewing the world, and certain views about contracts, will tend to be very strong in saying, no, that's not the case. I do think that tends to be a minority view. I think that tends to be a view that's held by people who are committed to a whole lot of other views. But I think many people do think that there clearly is some problem with the surrogacy contract. And in fact, two people in this room have written about surrogacy very well. I'm sure they're here. Fiorella, who is here, I think a colleague of mine, and Helen Watt, both, one of whom has a book out, the other has a book out, so you should speak to them about surrogacy, or about the ethics of surrogacy, surrogacy itself. So, what does surrogacy tell us? Well, it tells us something about, it's something involving sex, and it's involving the body. Surrogacy is interesting because pregnancy seems to be interesting. It seems to be a very special activity of a woman, which brings with it all sorts of obligations and interesting moral problems. And I suppose, broadly, what I want to say is that the body is the thing that is tending to be neglected by certain modern philosophical approaches, both to sex and other things. Sex is where it's very obvious. Because with something like a surrogacy contract, you're talking about the importance of biological bonds, you're talking about the relationship of pregnancy, what that means, the child's origins. All these things are grounded in our bodily nature. And I do want to say that we are bodily beings, we are embodied. Bodies are not just some appendages we carry about. They are the bodies of rational animals, but we're not just animals. Our bodies have a significance over and above that of an animal. Or why? Well, because I would say we have rational capacities, we have a capacity of theoretical reason aimed at truth, we have a capacity of practical reason aimed at good, practical reason being simply how we ought to behave, how we ought to achieve the good, and they have their seat in this body of ours. And, our bodies may not be much to look at sometimes, but they are who we are, and we are rather incredible. It's rather incredible that we exist as the kind of being that we are. Now, if you take seriously the idea of the body, okay, you are going to start asking a lot of questions about what it is that benefits the human being, what is it that makes a good human being, what is it that allows the human being to flourish. And that's going to include those things that help a human being flourish as the kind of body being they are. So health is a very obvious example, but of course, as rational beings, when we think about our body, our rationality is infusing our body. So our bodies take on an enormous significance in the kind of acts. And the sexual act is a very profound act, which can be procreative, which can unite us in a particular way with another bodily creature, let's say, another human being. And that act has a very particular significance and power. And it shouldn't therefore surprise us at all that when it comes to sexual phenomena, we are in a realm where there will be very special, distinctive kinds of obligations or attitudes that we need to adopt with regard to these things. How we flourish as human beings, you know, what I'm saying assumes some idea of the human being and of things in nature, that they are in a sense for something. In order to understand them, we need to have some notion of what it is for them to flourish. So in medicine, we obviously are very used to this idea. In medicine, the doctor understands what the organ is for and its place within the flourishing of the human being, and that doctor is a good doctor, the better he can realise that. And I'm saying that that's true of ourselves, our lives. We know what benefits human beings. It can be a complicated question to some extent, but we can, I think, make genuine assertions about what it is good for human beings, what is it that makes human beings flourish, and we can get that understanding from reflecting on human nature. I do think there is a human nature. I'm not an existentialist who says that we can't know anything about human nature, that we create ourselves or something like that. We do have a human nature. This seems to be evident, and in reflecting on that nature, we can come to some further conclusions, I think, about what it is for that nature to flourish, and to miss out the body when it comes to that, to say that the body's irrelevant, or indeed the body's organs are irrelevant, I think is to make a false move. It's to dismiss somebody's body, somebody's organs, as though they're not important. And I would say, excuse the company, but the sexual organs are rather important. They do have a particular importance and significance and distinctiveness in virtue of the kind of beings we are, in virtue of what can come about through them. And they are interestingly complementary. That is, they're not just like a kidney or something else, they are geared, as it were, outward, to somebody of the opposite sex. That is why they are there, if you like. Now, obviously there are lots of complicated questions about what people will do with them and other much bigger social questions. But at a fundamental level, there is this sort of interpersonal aspect to these kinds of union. And I think, just briefly, when we think about the interpersonal, when we think about sex and its particular relationship to love, which I won't go into here, when we think about that, we have to think really what is it that brings this social element about? What is it that is brings in social considerations? Well, one of the social considerations in relation to sex is that these kinds of activities can result in new human life. Now, if we take a view about new human life as having a particular dignity, say, or having a particular specialness, then, broadly speaking, we want to reflect back on the kind of acts that bring those human beings into existence. Do those acts also contain some kind of special dignity? Or should they? Should we view them in that way? But if we are talking about children and new generations, then we are also thinking in terms of what is best suited to encourage the flourishing of the children that may come to be through those activities. And then we're in the realm, I think, of talking about family arrangements and about marriage. And I would argue in favour of a particular natural view of marriage. This is not a view that depends upon religious views, but simply that kind of commitment has a particular role to play that honours our sexuality as rational beings and acts as in a protective way to any child may result. So I'll just quote a very short, bit rather dense and somewhat unromantic bit. It says the moral requirements for bringing new life into being clearly play a crucial role in determining what is or is not a desirable and morally good sexual arrangement. I want to suggest a thought experiment at this stage. Imagine trying to design an institution that would best protect the interests of children to be brought into the world. First, by making the conjugal sexual procreative act a necessary condition for a complete marriage, that is a consummated marriage as was traditionally held, one would tie the natural and appropriate act for generating children to the appropriate institution for the upbringing of children. Secondly, by restricting that act to the institution, one would protect children against the possibility of their coming to be outside of the appropriate institution for their upbringing. Such an institution would be justified on account of its relation to children in general, even if by natural accident no children were ever born from any given particular marriage. The question for a critic of this design institution would be, what is it that necessitates lifelong monogamy in marriage? Without the potential relationship to children, it is difficult to see. One, why the arrangement should be lifelong, and two, why the relationship should be restricted to two people. By privileging what I call the marital act within the institution, such that the very definition of entry to the institution depends upon the marital act, and vice versa, one protects the rationale for the institution. It's not a great chapter, but it is worth thinking about. Well, I don't actually want to get into a lot of the things, but obviously we're living at a time where marriage is being redefined, particularly. There's a lot of debates about gender. And I think a lot of these debates have their origin, if you like, in particular views about the body. If you don't view your body as essential to you in some way, then certain things seem to be up for grabs, possibly your gender, your sexuality. And there's a mass of arguments here, and you can't possibly go into them. Scientists will dispute various things, etc. But all I'm saying is that there seems to be a sort of displacement. And I think that's mirrored, this is just a very general thought, I think that's rather mirrored in some other ways, where we have a view, when we think about justice in society, we think about individuals, rational, autonomous individuals making contracts and agreements. Whereas I'm saying if we focus a bit more on what our bodies might be, those bodies have a social dimension that might make it more appropriate to think of our primary units, if you like, in terms of families, in terms of how we relate to other people, children. And that's, in fact, where most of us have come to be and contentful notions of the good that way, rather than through sort of rather abstract contracts. I realise that there's a lot of contentious stuff now, and just you have to read the book or buy the book to look more. But my final point would simply be to say that and this is personal, or it's people have different experiences. But things like falling in love, which anyone's been lucky enough to have that happen. And I think it often is a fall. It's not something we sort of plan or choose, things like that. It's something that occurs. Falling in love often seems to carry a tone with it of the other being irreplaceable in some sense. It might not always work out, of course, and all these kind of things, but there is that very strong sense which seems to be felt very, very widely by very many people in some way, shape or form. And it seems to be appropriate that that feeling of irreplaceability of another person and a lifelong fits very well with the notion of what it is to the institution of marriage, the purpose of marriage. Our falling in love seems to fit very well with it. Now you might say, well, you just grafted that on, or people have learned it in a particular way. But I sort of leave that out there, that our experiences of these things do seem to my mind at least, map quite neatly onto the idea that marriage might be some kind of natural thing. It might be something grounded in human nature rather than just the convention that Tom was talking about. I think that's everything I have to say. Thank you. Wondering whether to do Q&A, and I'm always rather I'm around if anyone wants to ask a question. Okay.
I mean, I just wanted to take up one thing, which actually you take up, this whole idea of the natural. I find it absolutely infuriating when people say that homosexuality is unnatural, because natural means, as Hume says, both in the treatise and the inquiry, it goes through different meanings of natural. And anyway, according to the various readings, it doesn't really matter. The point about there is something intrinsic to human nature, and that is that we're unnatural. We are gloriously unnatural, and that's why we are where we are, both for good and bad. I mean, there's greatness and there's also hellishness. But therefore, why not be homosexual? I mean, that's just part of our unnaturalness. And in another way, it is natural because clearly, all over the world and throughout time and space, there has been homosexuality of various sorts. And therefore, that is yet another manifestation of human beings.
Well, it's a very big question as to what is natural. That's certainly true, and I think the debate is not helped by any facile dismissal of that kind of thing. People take somewhat different views on this. I mean, whether something occurs or not is not. I don't think something like lying is a natural thing to do, but we all do it. Well, sorry. Some of us have occasionally. There are things that we do, there are activities, and I'm talking about activities, choices. I'm not talking about people's dispositions. There are things that people do that I want to say go against our nature in some sense, as in they diminish us as human beings. Now, we would probably agree that torturing people is in some ways unnatural or degraded or it's inhuman or
Not unnatural, but just degrading and...
So to speak. Well, okay, but I would take something like something being degraded to be something going against my nature. I suppose what I am saying is, and this is maybe the difference, is that when we talk about human nature, I mean something good and normative, as in there is a human nature that flourishes in a particular way, and this is how we ought to be. And in order to understand you as human beings, I have some notion of what it is to be a good human being. Disagree on quite a few things, we probably agree on an awful lot. If you do something degrading to that human nature, then you have done something, okay, you don't have to call it unnatural, but you have in some way diminished what you ought to be, and you can do that in a whole range of things. Now, if you say about the question of homosexuality, that's obviously a very big question. A lot of people will say, no, that's choice people make, or that's why people act out, and things like that. That's a whole big argument, and I agree. If someone just says it's unnatural, they're going to have to say a heck of a lot more about some social value, about But what I'm saying, I don't want to just dismiss the biological I think that's a problem.
Can I just say one last thing, which is, I mean, I really said two things. That in one way, homosexuality is natural in that it occurs. It's not statistically the norm, but nonetheless it's a norm in some way. But in another way, I'm saying that it doesn't really matter whether it's natural or unnatural, because there is no natural for human beings. We are gloriously unnatural. That's why we've got Bach. That's why we've got Shakespeare. And that's why we've also got torture.
Well, but don't we want to distinguish between Bach and torture? We want to say one is an example of a great use of something striving towards the truth of good. Torture, we would say, is not. Now, we can then argue about a huge range of things in between. And I certainly agree with you that the debate is sometimes not helped by a very hasty use of the word natural, or people applying to, say, inherent norms or statistical things. I'm interested in a teleological view, which is in a sense less interested in statistics as the idea that there are certain potentialities we have that are fairly fixed that can be fulfilled in certain ways. But yes, we do need to have a big social argument about that particular thing.
Anthony, it sounds as if you're equating natural with moral, and natural human being with moral human being. There has to be a difference. You know, and I know you're very I know that you're very assiduously avoiding any theological references, but I don't think the notion of original sin is very easy to get around in this particular argument.
Well, I mean, you talk about the notion of original sin. I mean, I'm simply saying that people generally agree, I hope, that human beings are capable of evil, indeed incredible.
Naturally.
Yeah.
That's
I think we can all agree, I hope we can all agree on that. I mean, if someone doesn't believe that, they really are dangerous. But, when you say about natural and good, well, again, we come back to this notion of natural. So people will mean somewhat different things. Some people will say something like, man is a rational animal. It is man's nature to be rational. That distinguishes him in some ways. And certain kinds of activity, torture, or I mean, I'm assuming some really horrible form of torture. I'm not going to get into debate about other forms of torture. But that if you engage in these activities, you are being irrational, and that goes against your nature. So in that sense, if you're going to use it that way, then that which is irrational is unnatural, that which is practically irrational is immoral. So there is a...
If you simply give an example of torture being utterly rational, for example, if there is a glass plant, as it were, in London, in purely rational terms, you can justify torturing someone who knows where it's hidden.
Well, okay, that's I've opened up a huge debate here.
It's a very...
But you see, okay, I think you're using rational in a way I probably wouldn't use, but if we assume, and you know, if you don't agree about torture, slot in something you think is definitely wrong, child rape or something, okay? If you think that certain circumstances, certain things could be rational, I'm going to say it can't be truly rational unless it's good in some way, practically. It might make sense in getting you from A to B. What's the best way to immiserate the enemy army? Rape all their children. Well, that's rational, you know, because that apparently, you know, empirically, I know that's going to work. So that will get you from A to B. But I want to say, if you're really concerned about rationality, you're going to have to be concerned about some genuine good at the end of it, which needs to inform your acts. So ultimately, you wouldn't be being rational by doing that. But part of the problem is that these terms, nature and good, are, you know, do need to be unpacked. And I do want to make some room for the biological. So obviously, there's sometimes a tension because when we talk about the biological, that seems very natural. We can talk about Aristotle looking at plants and the way things develop. You know, all of these are concerned with natural functions, let's say, and things like that. When we get to the more social level, we are still talking about rationality. We're talking about what it is for humans to be, what makes humans good in their activities. But that will be more contentious, generally, because it's more complicated.
Before I get to my question, I think there's a point I'd like to clarify, as I understand it, from the lady who asked the question earlier. I think there's confusion when we start throwing words around, norms and the word natural, because for certain, homosexuality, along with other orientations, demographically speaking, they are norms, demographically. But morally, no. Well, one can take a position that they're not, it's not a moral norm, although some would say it is. But so I think we need to distinguish between questions of morality and questions of demographics, and the two should not really be linked necessarily. There are all sorts of things that are demographically norms, but we wouldn't want to say they're necessarily preferred over other.
And I think that you need to tell a story as to why that is or is not right, which is another argument.
My question really is, you mentioned children and the institution of marriage being protected by the institution. Philosophically, how can we really, if we're not appealing to religion directly, and we're not appealing, you're not appealing to statistical studies, which show that children do better in families where the parents are married, how would you justify in terms of just pure reasoning, a priori reasoning alone? Do you go down that route? It's very
if you
difficult.
read chapter 3, there is, it's a good point. I mean, empirical studies, you're sitting next to a very eminent compiler of these kinds of statistics. She's disguising herself very well.
It's a challenge not to refer to any statistics.
No, what I think is, I do think that some religious things here can be a distraction, because what is being debated is marriage. Certainly the Catholic Church talks about natural marriage, so it says that this can be naturally known. Might be difficult, but it can be naturally known, and we can argue about this as an institution. But what we need to do is to think very carefully about what kind of goods and human flourishing there is involved. Now, I don't say empirical things can't tell us certain interesting things, but in a sense we need to view them through a philosophical lens, and what you think is rational and counts as important for consideration here will affect the way you look at the data. That's certainly true.
Because we need, can I just say, we need an argument that is not dependent upon the changing evidence that comes
Yeah,
before us.
and I suppose I'm trying to say that something like human nature is important. Okay. So that's the last question I'll take. Yeah.
I want to go back to your example, or disagreeable example about child rape, because if you think about it, it's quite a powerful example, because the normal argument is that that the key thing is consent, with sexuality, consent. And of course, with child rape, the child doesn't consent. But what does a very small child consent to anyway? Most of what happens to a small child, consent plays no role. So you have to say, what is wrong about this that isn't wrong about all the other things that is done with a child without consent? I think it's a strong example.
Well, thank you. I think that takes us back maybe to reflections on the body, or
Yeah.
some kind of integrity that is particularly offended and attacked I'm very happy to. Yeah. Last question.
Sorry, point to the body again, and you mentioned this, and from my sort of thinking back a long while ago to my time in criminology, which was historical, the last capital statutes to be abolished apart from those for murder related to the robbery of the person on the street or the invasion of their house, burglary in their house, because this was thought very much as an invasion of a sacred space almost, that you were violating them. So this was, that was very important. And we have a trend now, not only how does this fit when you have a trend now towards accepting all sorts of sexual variation, and to an extraordinary degree, and not just the invasion of pornography, but even if you look at something like the Times Weekend, which is promoting all sorts of extraordinary sexual variations, it's pornographic in itself. This, in a way, clashes with this view of the body as some kind of sacred space, that you don't do this in that area.
Yes, I think that's. I think D.H. Lawrence put it quite well. He referred to pornography as doing dirt on life,
Yeah.
and I thought there's a kind of staining that can come about by a lack of care in this area. And that's a very extreme example. It's also often find very bad attitudes to women, things like that. Right, well I think that's everything. There's still some drink left, I think quite a lot of drink, too much drink perhaps. So